Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm going to teach you about aperture, how it works physically in the lens, how it's controlled by your camera, and I'm also going to teach you how to use it creatively to either blur out your background, take sharper photos, or have everything in the photo all in focus at once. If you stay to the end of the video, I'll teach you how to use your aperture to create sunstars like in this photo. My name is Simon D'Entremont. I'm a wildlife and nature photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes on nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. So what is aperture? Aperture is one of the three main settings on your camera that you use to control your exposure levels, along with ISO and shutter speed. But it may be the most creative of the three because it allows you to drastically change the look of your photos. So let's talk about lens design. Aperture is the hole that's left after the diaphragm opens or closes to let in more or less light into your camera. It works just like the iris in your eye, where the iris opens or closes to allow more or less light into your eye. The pupil of your eye would be the equivalent of the aperture in your lens. You'll see here that as the diaphragm opens and closes, it affects how much light can get into your camera. The size of the aperture is described by what's called an F number, like f4, f2.8, f5.6, and is controlled by your camera by changing this number. Now, the number system works a bit in reverse and is a bit confusing at times because the smaller the number, the larger the aperture. The reason the numbering system is backward is because it's a ratio. It's a ratio of the length of your lens and the clear aperture, more specifically something called the entrance pupil, the amount of light that you see when you look in the front of the lens. If you have a 100mm lens and a 50mm aperture, that would give you f2 as a ratio. If you stop that lens down, that's the expression for closing the aperture down to 25mm, and with a 100mm lens, that would give you f4, 100 divided by 25. So lenses can be at f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8. Some lenses go all the way down to f32. So small f number lenses with large apertures are called fast lenses. That's because they collect photons faster and can take faster shutter speeds because they don't need to capture as much light. So various lenses come with a maximum aperture, that is the largest size hole of aperture that you can create with that lens. They also have a minimum aperture, but that's rarely relevant in most types of photography. You also change the aperture along with your ISO and your shutter speed as one of the three main settings that affects the brightness of your exposures. On my camera here, I use the thumb wheel, and when I roll the thumb wheel, it will change the F number and change the aperture of the lens. Now, there are three main attributes that are affected by the aperture of your lens. The first is how much light the lens will let into your camera sensor. Faster lenses, that is, bigger apertures or smaller F numbers, allow more light to come into your camera, allowing for faster exposures or lower ISOs. People who shoot in very low light environments like large aperture lenses that let in much more light, like this 50mm f1.4 lens that I use for Milky Way photography. For action photography, lenses with large apertures allow you to collect more light, allowing you to have more shutter speed or to shoot in low light environments like early in the morning or late in the day. For wildlife photography, I use this 500mm f4 lens. It has a very wide aperture at f4 for a long lens. It allows me to capture fast action or low light photography very well. If you want to freeze fast action in your photography, having lenses with wide apertures or opening the aperture of the lens that you're using as much as you can allows you to get more shutter speed without unnecessarily raising your ISO. If your ISO is getting really high, it means you're not letting enough light onto your camera sensor. Try opening up your aperture more to let in more light. Secondly, your aperture controls your depth of field. Your depth of field is the proportion of your image that's in acceptable focus. Larger aperture lenses have a shallower or thinner depth of field. That is, a smaller proportion of the image is in focus. This can be helpful to help blur out your background, which you may want to do for artistic effect. I do this in my wildlife photography all the time, that my photographic style for photographing wildlife is that the background is very blurry. That comes from having a lens combination and using my camera to have a thin depth of field, where only part of my target or all of my target is in focus, but in front and in back of my subject, it's not in focus and is blurry. So let's have a look at my owl friend here that we're going to be using for some photographic tests. And I'm going to take a series of photos with a wider aperture and then progressively stopping the lens down to smaller and smaller apertures. You'll see that as I do this, the background gets more and more and more in focus. I'll show you here a diagram of how that works. So here's a camera, our bird who is our subject, and a tree in the background. These lines represent light rays, and where they converge together, things are in focus. So this is the depth of field, the area of acceptable sharpness around my subject. You'll also notice, though, in the background, where the light rays diverge and are far apart, the tree in the background will be blurry. Now, this diagram is helpful for visualizing a few more things around depth of field. Number one is that wider apertures, which I'll show here by making the camera wider, have light rays that converge at a much steeper angle, making for a shallower depth of field. So the depth of field on the bird in this particular example is thinner than it was before. What this also does, though, it makes your background even blurrier. So wider aperture lenses have a thinner depth of field and make for blurrier backgrounds. Also, getting closer to your subject makes the light rays converge at a steeper angle and makes for an even thinner depth of field. This also makes the background even blurrier. All things being equal, longer focal length lenses will make a thinner depth of field and will also make the background blurrier. But wait, there's something else that happens. Longer focal length lenses will also magnify things in the background, make them much larger, which will make them look even blurrier in the background. That's why long focal length lenses are great for making blurry backgrounds. Now that's how you create a thin depth of field and have a blurry background, but let's say you want everything in your photo to be in focus, like in a landscape photo where you want everything near to very far to be in focus. The opposite is true. Wider angle lenses will give you a deeper depth of field, or making the aperture of your lens smaller will put more of the image in focus. By the way, for wide angle lenses, the amount that's in focus behind your subject and in front of your subject is actually not equal. For landscape photos or something where you want everything to be in focus, if you focus at the 1/3 point along your photo, you'll improve your odds that everything behind and in front of your subject are in focus. Thirdly, your aperture setting controls how sharp your lens is. Most lenses are sharper when they're stopped down. That is, the center of the lens elements are sharper than the edges. So by making a smaller aperture, you may improve the sharpness of your lens. Many lenses will be sharper stopped down to, let's say, f8, compared where they are shot wide open at their maximum aperture. But of course, this will cost you light, meaning you may not be able to use as high a shutter speed, or you may need to use a higher ISO. You can't stop down your lens indefinitely for more sharpness. There's something called diffraction that kicks in when the aperture is much too small. So shooting your lens at f22, for example, is probably less sharp than shooting it at f8. So let's start putting this knowledge to good use. How can we control the aperture to improve some of the creative aspects of our photography? First, are you shooting in a dark environment or you need lots of light to shoot some fast action? Use the wide aperture setting on your lens to try to capture more light, allowing you to have faster shutter speed or collect more light from this very dark environment. When I shoot Milky Way photography at night, it's very, very dark. I use the maximum aperture on my lens and I open my lenses as much as I can to try to gather as much light. I also shoot it on a tripod because I'm taking exposures of multiple seconds. But for Milky Way shots, if I'm opening up my aperture to gather more light because it's dark, we've already learned that I'll have a thin depth of field. If I'm shooting a field of sunflowers, how do I get them all in focus? You use something called focus stacking. In this photo here, I shot one shot for the sunflowers in the front of the field, I shot a second photo for the sunflowers in the middle, and I shot a third photo for the sunflowers in the back. Then I shot a separate exposure, much longer, for the Milky Way, and I merged the 4 photos together to create this one photo. So another way to use this information creatively, do you need a thin depth of field? Do you want to blur out the background? Do you want your subject to really pop out of the frame? Use a wide open aperture. It will give you a thinner depth of field. Only your subject will be in focus, and in front and behind your subject will be out of focus. This is the style that I use for my wildlife photography. Here's a few photos that I've taken where my subject is clearly in focus and the background and the foreground are way out of focus. And it creates a nice artistic effect as well. There are 2 other things you can do in addition to using a wider aperture if you want a blurry background. Number one is get closer. The closer you get, the thinner the depth of field, the more blurry the background. Secondly, have the background be farther distant from your subject. So if you want to take a photo of a subject and you want the background to be blurry, don't place your subject right in front of the background. Put it somewhere where the background is very distant. For example, this photo of a sandhill crane was walking along a field with some trees directly behind it, but I waited for it to get to a clearing where the background was clean before I took this photo, that way making the background much more distant and a much cleaner background, making the bird really pop out of the frame. Thirdly, do you need everything in your photo to be in focus? If so, use a very small aperture. Stop down your lens to f8, f9, that way you'll have a very deep depth of field. Also, remember for your landscape shots, focus at the 1/3 point in your composition. This is a common technique for landscape photography where often you want your whole scene to be in focus. Another way to creatively use your aperture is to slow down your shutter speed by reducing the amount of light in your camera. Let's say I'm photographing this waterfall and I want to show some movement in the water. One way to do this is to put a neutral density filter on my lens, which will allow me to slow down the shutter speed to, let's say, 1/2 second or 1 full second without overexposing my photo. But another way of doing this without using a neutral density filter is just to put your ISO at a low number like 100, put your camera on a tripod, make your aperture very small like f16. It will reduce the amount of light in your photo, allowing the shutter speed to go up to 1/2 second or 1 second, for example, and allow the movement of the water in the photo to be a really nice effect. Also, are your photos not as sharp as you'd like? Try making the aperture smaller. Try stopping down your lens to, let's say, f8 to see if it's sharper than when you shoot your lens wide open. Because controlling your aperture is a very creative and powerful way of doing photography, camera manufacturers have put a mode on most cameras, making changing the aperture the most important setting. It's called aperture priority, or AV, on most cameras. You can access it often by turning a dial on top of your camera that puts it into the AV mode. In that mode, you change the aperture and let the camera pick the ISO and the shutter speed. That way you have creative control of the aperture and you can make the camera take the type of photo that you want, either with a blurry background, everything in focus, or other attributes that you think are important that are controlled by aperture. And I said if you stay till the end, I'll give you a bonus tip. And that's that smaller apertures have another side benefit, is that when you have a very small aperture in your lens and you point it at a light source, it creates what's called a sunstar. That is spikes of light that are created by the aperture blades. And you can use these very creatively. There are two things you need to do though to maximize the appearance of these sunstars. Number one, you need a very small aperture. So using a very small aperture like f16, for example, will magnify these sunstar rays. You may lose a little bit of sharpness, but getting these sunstars are worth it. Secondly, you need to put this light source partially behind something. So you need to partially hide the sun by an object, a tree, a rock, a person, a lighthouse. So by having this light source partially hidden with a very small aperture will create these sunstars. You can really use these for creative effect in your photos. It makes a wonderful look. If the amount of light is very low and going into your camera though with a very small aperture like this, you might need to use a tripod. I hope you use this knowledge on how to control your aperture to go out the very next time and take great creative photos. Go get them.